Good morning. Appreciate you tuning in to another painting tutorial that I'll be starting this morning. I ask you to please subscribe to my YouTube channel, and hopefully some of my tips and tricks might be of value to you. We're going to start a new painting today, and this painting is a commission painting. The individual that requested this actually sent me a photo. So this is the photo. The artist was Guido Reni. He was an Italian painter back in between the 14th and 15th century in Italy. And he painted this painting of the Archangel Michael subduing Lucifer. And so he sent this photo to me and asked me if I could reproduce it. So that in and of itself is going to be an interesting challenge. I certainly don't often paint old Renaissance or Baroque period artists, but that's where we're at. The other challenge is they want it on a very small canvas, and this is a 7-inch by 9-inch canvas board that we'll be painting on. So it's going to be a very small painting, and I've gone ahead and I've just sketched in real quickly our subject. So just to kind of give you a little background, I did a little prep work here, and I started off by covering the back with acrylic. So started by using some really light purplish gray tones and kind of phase that into some more darker blacks. So we've got this kind of prepped here, and I've got my paint ready here to go. We're gonna paint the rest of this in oil, so we'll be using some small brushes, and we'll get this going. So it should be a fun and an interesting challenge to do this, and something definitely a little different and a little unique, painting on a much smaller surface. I'll be primarily painting on my lap. I think that as small of a surface that we're working on, it's just going to be much easier for me to just paint right in my lap and be able to get this underway. So I'll try to get the camera properly angled, maybe over my shoulder, and be able to show you how I tackle this. So let's get started. Okay, so I've come in here now and I've set up my palette. We're going to be starting again with oils, and we're going to be starting off with really painting in all the different flesh tones for the skin on our little angel and demon. So use a very limited palette here. Let me tell you kind of what I got going on here. I've got a little bit of burnt umber, ultramarine blue, phthalo red, phthalo yellow, and I've got titanium zinc white. And with those 5 colors, I've pre-mixed piles of my flesh tones. Here on the darker flesh tones, I'm primarily using the umber, blue, and red, and then kind of in these mid-range flesh tones, I'm introducing a little more yellows and reds with the blues and the browns, and then as we move into the lighter colors, using far less of our darker colors and a lot more of the yellow, reds, and whites, and just kind of get these all pre-mixed in here. That way we'll be able to kind of tackle this thing right away and get going on our flesh tones. Also, I'm just got a couple brushes I'll be using here. These are very fine. This actually is a 10-0 brush, And so I've got two of these, turn that music down. I've got two of these 10-0 brushes, very fine points on them, and one I'll be using for the dark tones, and one we'll be using for the light tones, and I want to do that so that I don't contaminate my brushes. We're gonna be using mineral spirits and nothing else. I'm not using any mediums. I'm not using any of our linseed oils. I'm not using any liquids. I'm not using anything. What I will be trying to attempt, though, is I don't want to use my mineral spirits too much. I'm going to be using my handy paper towel, and mostly as I'm going through colors, I'm going to be wiping my brush off and kind of cleaning it, just wiping it off with the paper towel, and then going back into my mixes. That way I'm not getting my paints too runny, or my brush is too wet as well. So that's what I've got starting off here. So again, we'll work on the panel here. We'll start in the face region, and then from that we'll go into the neck and move out into the arms and the legs. And I'll kind of save the wings and the clothing and everything kind of later. So I just would prefer to start on the flesh tones, and really I try to tackle this all wet on wet as best I can. It is a small painting, so it should go fairly quickly, but I will try to do this all wet on wet so I can use the blending times. And then later on, after I let it dry for maybe a week or so, I can come back and I can go over the dry portions of that with some other highlights and so forth that we can dry brush on. So that's how we'll get started here. So getting started here, I like to start with the face, and I usually will start around the eyes and nose and mouth region. And this being such a very tiny subject, it's going to be a little bit challenging. A little bit later, I'll change the angle of the camera and get a little bit of a better angle for viewing. My hand is a little bit in the way, so I apologize for that. But just getting in here and getting started in the center of the face, and then sort of working my way out from there. Fairly recently, I started doing a lot of the portrait and people work on top of acrylic. I started as an oil painter, and traditionally blocked everything and sort of tried to paint in the background around the primary subject, and that's always a little bit of a challenge. But I decided to start painting on top of acrylic, and I like the result from that, and I don't have to work as hard with trying to work around objects that way. So typically I'll try to bring in most of the background in acrylic and then paint on top of that in oil, and that just kind of works for me. So unfortunately, I have to kind of jump ahead here pretty quickly for the interest of time. This painting probably took me about 10 hours, and I shot about 7 hours of video footage. So I definitely have to kind of fast forward quite a bit to keep it within the 47 minutes or so for this tutorial. But I find it easier to premix all of my flesh tones, at least the primary mixtures. I usually mix 6 or 7 piles of flesh tones, varying in value from light to dark, but I still end up going into my piles and further mixing those piles into further piles of colors. But I tend to try to mix both on my palette, but also on the canvas. And as I paint uh, these types of figures and flesh tones on human beings, I do the wet on wet technique. I really enjoy the blending time that I get with that and try to take advantage of the blending time before it dries. And typically there'll be some further um, painting and refining on top of the dry paint when I let it dry for several days or a week or so. So now, having gotten into the face and the neck and chest, I can now block in the the hair here. And this entire painting was done on a very limited palette. Um, I really just used my five colors, my burnt umber, um, my my ultramarine blue, my cadmium red, my cadmium yellow, and my titanium zinc white. A little bit later, I do add a little bit of midnight black into the painting, but those six colors are really everything I pretty much used on painting this figure. So very limited, very simple palette that way, and then just pre-mix those colors out. So what I like to try to do usually is I like to just hit all the areas in which the flesh is exposed. So working into the face, and then I'll move into the arms, eventually into the leg region, just while I have the wet pre-mixed paint on my palette. And I can get that all worked in. As you see now, I'm working in the arm. So block in those colors. A lot of times I like to um, try to define exactly where my shadow and my light is, and slowly transition the two right on the canvas, um, to have a nice soft blended transition there. So that's kind of my method to the madness. I'll eventually move into the wings and then the clothing region. But if you've tuned into any of my other videos um, of my portrait work, you'll see that I tend to kind of take this particular approach with just taking advantage of my palette while I still have it handy and available, and try to get it all kind of blocked in with the skin tones. So I'll try to get about 90% complete on just blending and mixing and getting these flesh tones, and then later on I like to come back and do some refining on that. So if that works for you, I'd give it a try and see if you enjoy that. There's definitely a lot of methodologies when it comes to doing portrait work or people work, and this is just the one that I like to do the most. So obviously I've come through and sort of did a rough sketch of my figure, so I kind of have my basic guide here, and then I'll just kind of work over that and around that. So now I can move it here into the leg region. This leg is a little bit more in shadow, so I'm using more of my darker flesh tones, the blues and the umbers, some of the reds, and and then in my highlighted region, I'll kind of introduce a little more of the reds and yellows to that. But this one's going to be a little bit more in shadow. Get this all kind of worked in. Later on, after I let it dry for a few days, I'll come back and I'll just paint in the sandals right over that. But it's just good to kind of figure out where my light source is hitting right now. As I said, this is a first for me. I don't typically do the Renaissance style paintings so much. So it was an interesting challenge for me when I got this request, and certainly an interesting challenge because the canvas is so small. And I find that, maybe folks disagree with this. I find that the smaller I have to paint, the more challenging that is, and it's much easier to paint with larger brushes on larger surfaces. Um, but it's definitely a good practice here for me. And I'm always looking to stretch myself and my abilities and see what I can do, and be prepared to make mistakes. And that's perfectly fine. That's how we learn. So just getting this other leg kind of worked in here now, and quite a bit of light is hitting this particular leg. So, but need to really think about the bone structure, the muscularity, and the anatomy of human the human, so that you really kind of think about how that skin would be laying across the flesh and bone, and trying to simulate as close um, as close in proximity to realism on that. So now I've got the flesh tone going here. I'm moving into Lucifer now, and I'm kind of he's definitely more in shadow. Um, he's sort of trying to crawl out of the pit, and the Archangel Michael's kind of subduing him. So he's going to be more in shadow, and just a little bit of highlight on him here. But I'm just kind of bringing that in right now, and I'm kind of identifying the muscularity in the shoulders, and where I'm going to see the ripple of the flesh, and try to paint that kind of all in right now, block it in, and then I can bring in some of my other darker tones and around that, and sort of blend them directly on the canvas together. And that's kind of what you kind of see me doing right now here. So it's getting that kind of all brought in and figured out. But again, I just wanted to get these two figures kind of painted in primarily, and then and it doesn't have to be anything perfect, but for the most part, get the majority of the way through it, and then I can go back later on. I typically like these figures to dry, as I said, for several days, even up to maybe a week or so, and then go back with sort of a dry brush blending approach, and bringing in some softer tones right over that, and be able to maybe bring in a little bit more highlight. And that's just the method I like to take on that. The challenge with working acrylics is just really, for me anyway, it's more of a patience factor. Um, I like to see my results, but I need to be patient to allow for layering and blending and drying time, when it's appropriate for me to come back and continue to work on something. So I definitely recommend that if you're painting in oils, it's probably good to have a couple projects going on, so that as you lay one aside, you can focus on another one while the first is drying. So just a little bit of advice on that. So I'm working his little face now, and his beard, and he's kind of looking down. So we're just kind of getting more of a bit of a profile. And with Lucifer, there's not an enormous amount of detail. As I said, he's really in shadow, and in that, I think the artist, or the original artist, did that by design. Obviously, he's a darker figure. So painting him, I didn't have to put nearly as much time and detail on him as I did with Michael. And Michael is certainly the central figure of the painting, and so he's draped more in the light, and I think it draws the eye to that. But if you've never painted the old masters, um, obviously I'm nothing in comparison to the original version of this, and I imagine the original version is quite large, but it's a good exercise to go and maybe attempt that. It's always it's always good to continue to stretch yourself and kind of get out of your comfort zone. So having this particular commission was certainly something that is good for me, and I wasn't really ready, or I wasn't really, again, I've never done it, so. But I think it's just building your confidence and just seeing how it goes, and that's how we all kind of improve and get better. So kind of work this out. I'm starting to work now into the wings. The wings are very dark, and I'm using mostly umber and red as my two primary colors, with a little bit of white for opaquing it. But it's a really dark wing, and just wanted to bring that in. And as you see, I'm really blocking in the whole thing, because what I want to do is I want to take some pure uh, flesh tone color and go back over that. I know that by taking the pure flesh tone and going over the dark blocked in underpainting, will pick up some of that painting, and allow the two to sort of blend together. So that's what I'm trying to do. And unfortunately, I'm kind of cutting myself off a little bit with the camera, so I apologize for that. But I'm just using my larger flat brush here to do this, and just making some simple brush strokes to create the pattern of those wings. And of course, you don't want to kill that underpainting, so certainly skip to allow for the division in the feathers in doing this. So again, I block this entire wing in, and then just go back with some of the lighter flesh tone color, and sort of just paint this over that background, and let that paint pick up the underpainting, and it'll still stay muted and dull and rather dark, and that's kind of what I wanted. Later I can come back once that dries a little more, and I can add some more subtle highlights to that. So just a little technique that I like to use on things such as that. So now I'm starting to work on the shoulder now, and really just using my ultramarine blue, a little bit of white, and a little bit of umber to sort of gray it out a little bit. Um, but wanted to start working on these shoulders, blocking those in, and sort of like the wings, go back with some more pure, kind of, excuse me, a little bit more pure white to paint right over that blue, and that'll sort of kill that intense white and pick up some of that blue underpainting and create a real nice light, nice light blue. And then now we're moving into the chest region here. So Obviously, the left side of the body is going to be quite in shadow. I'm really using pure ultramarine blue here. I'm not even mixing anything. I'm just taking the pure blue in its form, and I'm just getting that in here, and then I can bring in my lighter blues, and then I can just really blend them together directly on the canvas. And as a reminder, I'm not using any mediums whatsoever. I'm not using liquid. I'm not using linseed oil. I'm using the paint from the tube directly. I wanted it to be rather stiff, and that stiffness allows me to blend really nicely directly on the canvas. And as I bring those two colors together, um, I'll be able to just wipe my brush right off and keep a really dry brush, really no paint whatsoever, and start to blend the two regions together and create a nice transition color. So don't necessarily have to do it this way. You can certainly premix these and just paint those transitions. But for me, I enjoy doing it this way. Again, just taking advantage of your slow dry time, using the wet on wet technique to your advantage. But you can certainly do what you like. There's a lot of roads that would lead to the same result on this. So now a couple days have gone by, and my wing is a little bit drier. So I can come back now, and I'm taking some real light bluish brown that I've mixed together with my ultramarine blue, my umber a little white, and creating this grayish tone that I can come back through on top of this and dry brush this on. You don't want a lot of paint on the brush. You want to keep it very, very dry in doing that. All right, so I'm now coming back and just a little more detail on the shoulder here. He's got a lot of ruffles and pleats in the shoulders that I'm seeing from the original painting, and so I'm just trying to figure out, um, you know, getting that extra detail in here using some of my gray tones and some of my darker blues, and creating a little bit of shadow from these ruffles now. And the hair is a little drier now, so I can come back and add a few more highlights to that. And again, I'm just using my flesh tones. I've now changed my camera angle, which I think is a little bit better for the viewer to kind of see what I'm doing here. This is Lucifer's tail that I'm kind of bringing in right now, and there'll be a little bit of hellfire kind of creeping up from the crevices in these rocks. So there's going to be a little bit of some highlight from those flames hitting this tail here. I wanted to bring this in though right now, just kind of block it in and bring some initial highlight. Later on I'll come back and add a little bit more of my reds and oranges to highlight that up. And now I'm working on Lucifer's wing. He's got kind of these bat wings. So again, a lot of it in shadow. I just blocked the entire wing in some really dark red and umber, and now just going over that and trying to find the little ribbing in his wings, but keep it pretty subtle. And I'll work a little bit more on that. Right now, it's just primarily just kind of blocking in those regions real quick and adding some initial highlight to that. Okay, so I'm scooping ahead here a little bit. I did add some of the glow from the Hellfire a little bit at the bottom here. I'm now working on this this cape that Michael's wearing. It's red, um, and so I'm sort of just figuring out here, bringing in all my dark values. I've taken uh, cadmium red and my burnt umber, created a really kind of dull, muted, dark reddish tone. And going through here, and I'm just kind of identifying where I'm seeing all of the folds in the fabric. And I can bring in those dark areas first and then come back with a little bit lighter red tones here, which you see me doing right now. This is more of just a pure cad red that I'm kind of bringing in here, and then I'm transitioning the two and blending right on the canvas once again. So just doing a lot of that. I've kind of pre-mixed 3 or 4 different values of this red on my palette, and then just bringing them right onto the canvas, and then I'm further blending the two on the canvas directly as they kind of meet together. So just kind of figure out all of this real quick right now. And again, I'm cutting this off, so I apologize. I'm not always the best cameraman. These little canvases are quite challenging. As I said, I really needed to kind of work in my lap. It's really hard to put a canvas of this size on an easel and try to paint right on the easel. It's easier to kind of manipulate and move around the small little canvas on my lap, and I can twist and turn it to get all my different angles. Just works best for me, and so that's kind of what you're seeing me do. But it does add a little bit of a challenge when it comes to trying to capture what I'm doing on camera. So again, just coming back here now, adding some of my highlights, and this kind of helps this to really kind of come to life right now. Work on the other side here, just the same as we did on the left, and so once again, find my dark folds, bring in my darkest red tones, and then come back with slowly building in my lighter tones, and try to identify where I'm seeing these ruffles and these folds in this fabric. As I've mentioned before, there's definitely a different mindset painting with oils over acrylics. And I could have painted this in acrylic as well. I really wanted to have the richness of the oils for this painting. Obviously, the old Renaissance masters always created their own oils and created their own mediums, and always painted in oil. Certainly, acrylic wasn't even thought of or invented back in those days. But wanted to get that kind of painted in oil and really enjoy the slower dry time. Okay, so we're kind of getting down here into his skirt region, and the same theory as when I worked into his shirt, was to bring in the dark and the light and then mix them together and get that subtle blend. A lot of shadow in this skirt, so I'm using pure ultramarine blue and then just bringing a little bit of white to make a mid-tone sort of light ultramarine blue, and then my highest highlights will be more of a really pale blue-white color. So now just kind of identifying some of the folds that I'm seeing in the fabric as I work off this photo image. And it was certainly fun. I definitely enjoy doing religious paintings. I've done several of the Savior over the years, and it's fun to get back into this a little bit. So Michael is carrying a sword. I've let many days go by now and allowed those wings and that cape to dry sufficiently that I can just paint this sword right over those. So working on that, I'm as you can see my palette here that I've been mixing and pre-mixing things on. So just kind of painted a nice gray color using my blue and my umber, and then just lighten the value up with some ultramarine or with some titanium zinc white to get that. But using a lot of small brushes on this and a lot of patience and time. Most of this painting was painted with a number 0 small round brush. So certainly takes time to do that. But when you're working on such a small surface and such a small subject with really, really fine detail and fine lines, it really requires slowing down significantly and using these little brushes. And that's not for everybody, but I enjoy detail and enjoy trying to paint details, so this is certainly up my alley. And going back into the hair again, I'm going to slowly go back and refine little things along the way, and continue to do that throughout the entire painting. So we'll get this kind of worked out, but it's really starting to come along now here. And now what I'm working on are these sandals. He's got these kind of golden bluish sandals. There's a lot of kind of ribbons running up his leg, and so I've let, again, many days go by, allow these legs to dry sufficiently that I can just paint right over them and get these sandals kind of worked in. And again, I'll just mention, I've mentioned in past videos, the palette I'm using is actually a Stay Wet Masters series palette that I typically use for acrylics, and I've got a second one that I use for my acrylics, and they have a nice little rubber lid that can pop on top and seal everything in. And I just got the idea to try to use it for my oil paints. I went to Michael's and had them cut me a sheet of glass that fit into the bottom of this Stay Wet palette, and then I like to kind of seal it up so that it can keep my paints for several days or several weeks. And I use clove oil as well. I just drop a little bit of clove oil into on a cotton ball and just throw it in the corner, and the chemicals from the clove help to slow the oil paint drying on the palette. I also like to throw the palette into a refrigerator or a freezer if I know that I'm not going to be painting for several days. This is just a great way to be able to preserve your paints, and we all know paints are quite expensive, so it's already I've already taken the time to pre-mix everything, and it would just be a shame to lose that. So that's kind of how I like to preserve my paints, and the process works pretty well. So um, give it a try and see if it works well for you as well. All right, so um, coming back through here now, and we've added quite a bit. Kind of fast forwarded here. Um, I'm now at the point where I feel like I can sort of work on my ease a little bit more, and introducing some of the rocks and stonework here in the foreground, um, and try to give that illusion that Michael's standing right here at the edge of the pit, I guess, of hell. And so I've already added in my soft little glow from the hellfire, and can kind of work these stones around a little bit more. So, um, but yeah, it was a really interesting painting. Certainly something that I've never done before, and I was fairly pleased with the results. So now I'm kind of working in some of the more distant stones here and adding just a little bit of red and yellow, and creating some orange tones that I can kind of bounce those colors off the rock as if the light's kind of hitting them from beneath. And I've mixed, again, just a little bit of gray with my blue and umber here to highlight these stones. And you don't need a whole lot of detail in these. Matter of fact, I think it's just better to have the background and even some of the foreground a little bit more basic and muted, which is why my acrylic underpainting was really just pretty simple from the beginning. And you really don't want to detract away from that that focus of the Archangel Michael, which I think was really what the original artist was going for. So now I'm at this stage where I can do a little bit more refining work, um, and coming and adding a little bit more highlight, um, a little bit more lines, and getting things a little bit more detailed. Some of that smaller, finer detail here. So I'm trying to paint in just the shadow from that sash. He's got that little pink sash he's wearing, um, and I knew that would just cast a small little shadow. There are a couple times I sort of detracted away from the original painting. There were some things I just wanted to have a little bit of an artistic license on and kind of make my own judgment calls on as well, that I felt like could improve my painting particularly. And so I did digress just slightly, but for the most part, I tried to stay as true as I could to the original piece of work. And there I am getting text messages and phone calls along the way, so I apologize uh, for that showing up in the video. So coming in with a little bit more pure, well, not really pure white. I've still muted it with a little bit of red to make a really pale pink, but now I'm coming back and just really kind of hitting some of the highlights here a little bit more, make it a little more bold. We certainly want him to stand out, and he's an angel of light. A lot of these old masters, they would use live subjects. They would hire men and women off the streets to come in and pose in certain fashions, and or even wear certain clothing. And a lot of times they would have to stand there for hours as their figures were getting blocked in. So today we have the luxury of using iPhones and iPads and photographs and so forth that I don't think the masters back in those days had such a luxury. So they really had to rely on bringing in live subjects to help them with that. But it was really quite amazing what they could accomplish with poor quality brushes and poor quality paints that they oftentimes had to create themselves. And a lot of these artists were almost like scientists. They had to kind of figure out um, how to figure out how to create these different colors sometimes, and they used all sorts of interesting uh, things from nature to accomplish that. So I'm coming back now with some pure black. I just and I use it pretty sparingly, but I wanted to create some more kind of darker shadowing in certain areas in the most dark regions. And that's kind of what you see me doing right now. But I'm kind of hitting that final stage, and so that's kind of the painting. I appreciate you tuning in. I hope that you can please subscribe to my YouTube channel, Marc Harvill Art. And again, it was a lot of fun to work on the painting. Give it a try. Try to paint on small surfaces. You might enjoy it. Thanks for tuning in. Bye now.